what we call mind, that is our thoughts, our memories, our feelings, our awareness, our emotions, is certainly correlated to the activity of the brain, but it is also independent and more than the electrochemical activity of the brain.
Dr. Piero Parisetti, thank you so much for giving me the chance to speak to you today. The reason why I wanted to talk to you is because, like yourself, I found myself over years of research that people tend to associate the idea of the afterlife with the traditional path of, religion, dogma, faith, creed, however you want to call it. And it feels to me that since the emergence of two medical inventions in the 70s, being the defibrillator and CPR, I feel that for the first time in history, we were able to get a lot of people come back from the dead. And I don't need to tell, 20% of them are coming back with a near-death experience. So it feels that for the last precisely 50 years, we've done a lot of progress in what we call the emergence of the field of near-death studies. So I am a big proponent, and I know you are as well, so I'll let you speak about it in a minute, that these days we need somehow distinction between those who, let's say, come to grips with the afterlife through the traditional path of, as mentioned, religion, faith and creed, versus those that only accept evidence and facts. So I've coined a term, the term being afterlifer, to describe the latter. And I was wondering, based on the description that I've just given you, would you consider yourself an afterlifer?
100%, Dani, absolutely. First of all, thank you very much for having me on this interview, and I think you've captured pretty well my past. However, I have to be a little more precise because, of course, you as IANDS, as an IANDS person, your focus is primarily on near-death experiences, which I personally consider one of the pillars. It's certainly a pillar, but one of the pillars of a much larger edifice that supports what I call a rational belief in life after life. A belief which I call rational, exactly as you say, because it is not based either on faith on a holy book, a spiritual tradition, the words of a guru. So not that. It's not based on a personal experience. People have spiritually transformative experiences. Bless them, lucky them, but that's not been my case. I, over a period of in excess of 20 years now, I've developed what I call a rational belief which is based on the knowledge and critical examination of facts, so empirical evidence. And this rational belief is supported by, I would reckon, about 12, then it depends how you cut the cake, but let's say, for the sake of discussion, let's say about 12 areas of evidence, coherently and consistently pointing to the fact that, in a way we do not understand, human personality seems to survive physical death. And that's the simplest way I could encapsulate the article of faith of this rational belief. Near-death experiences is one of these areas. I would say one of the three real major pillars supporting this edifice. But for me, it's one. Let me tell you, since I have the floor, Mr. Chairman, let me go.
Yes, please. The stage is yours.
And say that my rational belief, in fact, has two articles of faith, because before there's the idea, I repeat myself, that in a way we do not understand human personality seems to survive physical death. Before that, there's a possibly even more fundamental article that says that what we call mind, that is our thoughts, our memories, our feelings, our awareness, our emotions, our psychological life. generally speaking, is certainly correlated to the activity of the brain, but it is also independent and more than the electrochemical activity of the brain. And you understand that I put this building block below survival, because once a person, through the knowledge and critical examination of evidence, of facts, understands that our mind is more than molecules and potentials in the brain, then it's easier to accept the idea of survival. And here I close my long introduction, because NDEs are crucial in my understanding, because before clearly pointing to the idea of a life after life, they demolish the equation that says mind equals brain. You know, if NDEs, as are phenomenologically described and researched clinically, are what they appear to be, it is clear that mind is more than the brain. And so NDEs are doubly important in that way.
Yeah. No, that's great. So I'm familiar with your 12 areas of interest. I don't know if we have the time to go through all of them, at least, skim through them.
Well, at least the main ones, perhaps, yes.
Please, because, I think our viewers would appreciate enormously the fact that there are different ways these days that science is catching up with to be able to reach very similar conclusions.
It's interesting you say these days, but survival of human personality and its survival of physical death by H.W. Myers, one of the founding fathers of the Society for Psychical Research, is about 130 years old. And I mean, these very learned scholars, you remember Cambridge and Oxford scholars of the Victorian era in the UK, they founded the SPR, the Society for Psychical Research, exactly for that, to take a scientific approach, a scientific angle on all these things that seem to point to the two articles of faith I mentioned. So mind does not equal brain, and mind survives physical death. So it's not only now that we have this vision. These are old concepts that have been investigated for, let's say, I would say a good 150 years. Wow. By some of the brightest scientific minds, not only scientific, I would say minds in general of the planet, because we certainly have scientists, including 4 Nobel Prize winners, but we have philosophers and magicians and very bright and intelligent people. So if we look at this edifice of the evidence, as I call it, truly an ocean of evidence, because it is very difficult to do justice at the quantity, the diversity, the depth of the available evidence in support of these two things. And analytically, I always looked at this as separate but closely linked areas, because, as I say, they are diverse in nature, but they all point to the same conclusions. And the first area of evidence for me, it's very important, because it supports that number one article of faith, that mind is more than brain, and that's parapsychology. Parapsychology as the study of what we call psi. I'm writing yet another book now, and I've struggled with the definition of psi. Let's take, for the sake of saving time, the classical view that says the psi is the powers of the mind, essentially. Telepathy, precognition, and presentiment, remote viewing, and psychokinesis. And all these things, if they are true, and they have been proved to be true by thousands upon thousands of laboratory experiments, published by hundreds of top-level scientists in exactly the same peer-reviewed scientific journals where we publish other things. and the conclusions are inescapable. Like Jessica Utz, Professor Emerita of Statistics at the University of California at Irvine, says psychic functioning has been demonstrated by the same methods used in any other discipline or branch of science. End of story. Skeptics who say, 100 years of nothing are either ignorant or intellectually dishonest. I am sorry to say, I don't want to pick a fight, but that is the only conclusion one can draw. Look at the bloody literature, look at the peer-reviewed journals, look at the experiments and the meta-analysis. We are looking, Dani, at millions, I mean millions of individual trials. If you sum up all the individual trials of the thousands of experiments in peer-reviewed papers, you amount to several millions, probably more than 10 million individual trials. Wow. The conclusions are that psychic powers exist. If they exist, the inescapable conclusion, as I keep repeating, is that mind is more than the brain. And that, for me, although it's independent from the survival hypothesis, it's logically very important because it's already a push in that direction. Then we have research on so-called out-of-body experiences. And out-of-body experiences are important in their own right, and because they are one of the key components of the near-death experience, which we all know about. And why OBEs? I put OBEs in a different category because it's in a way it's psychic powers on dope. It's supercharged psychic powers, if I may say so. In as whilst if we say that a remote viewer, for instance, sits in a laboratory room, is given geographic coordinates, and somehow manages to produce information about a remote location that for which he or she has been only given geographical coordinates, and that's extraordinary enough. In out-of-body experiences, it is the sense of self, the center of consciousness and perception that appears physically located out of the body. The lived experience of the OBEer is like a waking consciousness transferred somewhere else. And let's remember the famous experiment of Charlie Tart, a revered professor of psychology. Then with the American Society for Psychical Research, he had this female subject who has gone down in history as Miss Z, because to protect the name, who claimed to be able to leave her body at will during sleep. And Tart put her in a lab room, wired up to an EEG monitor and everything, and she went to sleep. And Tart had put a 5-digit number on top of the shell, well above the bed where Miss Z was sleeping. And sure enough, during the night, Miss Z could leave her body, read this 5-digit number, and come back with the right number. So that is pretty hard evidence. The statistics are phenomenal. If you think of our 5%, never mind. Let's not get into that, but are pretty solid. And experiments like that have been repeated with other subjects. And in one case, sorry, I'm going into particulars, but it's so interesting. Please do. Yeah. And if perhaps our viewers have heard of this guy called Alex Tanous. Alex Tanous was a very interesting, multiple degrees in various disciplines, but also a very gifted psychic. I don't know how to say, because he had various psychic abilities. And Carlis Ozis of the ASPR put him again in a room and asked him to locate his consciousness inside another room of the lab where there was a particularly complex thing, inside which there were electronic detectors. Thanos not only was able to describe what was into the measuring apparatus, but the apparatus itself detected a presence.
Wow.
So we are really stretching things to it's bizarre. And as I say, this is not anecdotal. And mind you, I do not commit the primordial mistake of discounting anecdotes. That's stupid. That's in science and philosophy of science terms, that's a primordial mistake. Anecdotes are very important, and we have to take them into account as we build a picture of reality. However, the tests, the experiments we are talking about are controlled laboratory experiments in which the researchers have control on every parameter. So if we show an effect, there's not many alternative explanations to the fact that somehow Alex Thanos projected his consciousness into this measuring apparatus. So in a way, OBEs for me transition from the pure psychic powers of parapsychology into survival research. Okay, that's a sort of a bridging. Then getting into survival research, I don't think I need to say anything about near-death experiences, because that's what IANDS exists for, and that's what I think our listening public knows more about and best. So I will not dwell on that. There's another very important area for me around end-of-life events, which is deathbed visions. And deathbed visions also I consider a sub-primary pillar, so still a pillar, maybe not as huge as NDEs, but also very important. Deathbed visions are a super well-known phenomenon, encountered regularly by all the professionals who are near people when they die. And these are typically not the medical doctors, these are nurses and hospice workers, and obviously the families of the dying. To the point that the phenomenon is so well known that there are universities, nursing degrees, which have a module on deathbed visions. Because they know nurses and hospice workers will be faced with this phenomenon very often in their lives, and they want to prepare them. Obviously, universities do not take an ontological position about what these experiences are or what they mean. Yeah, however, they say this is going to happen, know about it, and know how to, in a way, validate the experience, because that's very important for the person who's having them. In a nutshell, the research tells us that about 10% of us are conscious at the moment of passing. Of this 10%, 2/3, imagine the numbers. Imagine the number of people who are dying daily. Take 10% of that 10%, 2/3 have visions of what appears to be an afterlife and see people, typically deceased relatives, and have long interactive conversations with these people who are said to have come to help to bring them over, essentially, as facilitators. This is, I think, humanly very nice, because it speaks against one of the fears of mankind. That's the fear of dying alone. It seems that we do not die alone. We die surrounded by the loved ones we had when they were in life, and that's somehow comforting. Deathbed visions, and this I open and quickly close parenthesis, are parts of a larger phenomenon which is totally really baffling, which is this terminal lucidity. because it is true that when the moment at which a deathbed vision happens, the person is often not well. They're about to die, they're suffering, they're not necessarily entirely lucid, and they're in a bad state. And all of a sudden, the clinical and cognitive conditions are transformed. These people sit up on the bed, they lit up in their face, they raise their hands, and they start talking. And my own dad, apparently, this is something I learned recently, but when my dad died, he had maybe 24 hours of coma, essentially, and consciousness before he passed. And at some stage in his hospital room, I was not there. I had left momentarily, and my wife at the time was in the room. And apparently my dad opened his eyes and said, "Magnifico," in Italian. That's magnificent, wonderful, that's great. That's a small thing. But normally these deathbed visions last for a long time, and as I say, complex exchanges and conversation, and so terminal lucidity includes cases of, and this has been published not in the the Ghostbusters magazine, monthly magazine. This has been published in Science, okay, one of the most revered peer-reviewed publications. There's a well-documented literature of cases of people suffering, for instance, from Alzheimer, who perhaps have been non-communicative, zero, essentially, with all respect, a vegetable for months on end. 24, 36 hours before they die, they wake up, and the lady says to the daughter, "By the way, I meant to tell you that the key for my chest of drawers, where you will find my antique watch, is on the second drawer to the left," and have a perfect normal conversation, and then they go. This again, please, materialist theorists of consciousness, explain that to me. Explain that to me in terms of molecules. It's I cannot explain it, but I cannot accept the banal explanation that our brains, we are not, obviously. So before we leave this very important area of evidence, let me tell you the two little nails in the coffin of the attempts to explain the deathbed visions away. We know from two things, that there are at least a couple dozens well-documented examples in literature of deathbed visions in which the dying person sees and interacts with deceased relatives he or she did not know they were dead at the moment where the vision takes place. Okay. Oh, but it says these are hallucinations. People fantasize because they want to see their dead mom who comes to bring them in. All right. So how come people see their dead sister, whom they did not know the sister had died 2 days before, and the information was kept not to, make the situation of the dying person worse? So this is really bizarre. But perhaps the most intriguing research finding is that people who think they're going to die but make a recovery do not have deathbed visions. People who think they're going to recover but end up dying have deathbed visions. So like in the case of NDEs, it seems that it's really the proximity to the actual moment and to the real event of passing, of leaving the body behind, that somehow opens up the doors of perception, as Aldous Huxley say, and allows us to see beyond the constraints of the space-time constraints that we normally live in the waking consciousness. Are we okay? Am I speaking too much?
The more you speak, the more questions pop up. So we'll have to see how we can manage them all. No, and I think you raised a very valid point there. Sorry to interrupt a second, but a couple of points. I think you said it correctly. So you must know Albert Heim, which probably made the very first, let's say, methodical study on near-death experiences when the terms hasn't been coined yet. And he was describing those people falling from mountains in general, from scaffoldings. And people are aware of near-death experiences, but not often they realize that there's also near-death-like experience in which people actually enter the OBE, out-of-body experience, before impact. And that's what Albert Heim was describing. So it feels to me that it's not the actual event of clinical death that causes the and we can talk about shared death experiences as well, but is the perception that we have. So if we know that we're going to die before the impact, we may actually already leave our bodies and enter that NDE state, which I find fascinating.
Beautiful remark. Thank you very much. But if we want really to get closer to the bottom of it, we also have to take into the account as a very long equation with many different factors. So yes, NDEs, the classic NDE happens in a variety of situations where there is an actual threat to life or the perceived threat to life. So I have nothing to add to that. Absolutely agree. However, studies in children seems to relate the severity of the condition to the likelihood and depth of the near-death experience. So although fully blown NDEs can be had in situations in which there is no threat to life, there's no compromised brain activity, and yet people have NDEs. However, as I say, looking at children in particular, Melvin Morse find out that the closer children were to actual dying, the deeper and the more likely and the deeper was the near-death experience. So somehow we have to put that into the pot and try to make sense of that. So both things are true.
Obviously, you and I had the privilege to dig deep into this field of research from different angles for a number of years. So one question that I ask all my guests is, what would you recommend to anyone that's skeptical about the notion of the afterlife to do in order to maybe, approach themselves into this new world vision?
The word skeptical comes with a lot of baggage. We must understand what skeptical means, because skepticism, as we see it in organized skepticism, is not skepticism, is a strongly held belief, almost religious belief. Pre-scientific, if I have to say, in philosophy of science terms. So science, if we want to say a banality, a platitude, science is certainly not a set of ideas, but it's a method. And the method, and I see it really, I'm sorry for being so banal, but at the bottom line is that the method says, follow the evidence and go where the evidence takes you. And that really, that's the primary school definition of science. Organized skeptics are pre-scientific in as they let their own convictions and positions trump evidence. They ignore evidence, they try to suppress evidence, they alter evidence to try to proper their own beliefs. And so, a skeptic of that kind is beyond salvation, if you see what I mean. If you ask me what a person who has doubts about possible survival, that's a much better way of putting things in this perspective. Remember that I myself am a Western educated medical doctor. I grew up in an environment which says if you cannot touch it, if you cannot measure it with instruments, it does not exist. And I was totally happy with that worldview for many years. And when I started studying these funny subjects we're talking about, it took me a while to let go. So, it's the to and fro process and yet I think that an intellectually honest person has to consider the evidence and draw his or her own conclusions. Here again, I'm sorry, I'm always diverging, but this is interesting because I'm speaking with an interviewer who obviously knows a lot and hopefully to a public who also is interested and knows a lot. Imagine that I am answering your question. I'm taking just a long way home. Imagine that my really specialty, my particular area of research at university is in clinical parapsychology, and I am researching the effect that engaging with evidence about evidence pointing to survival has on the grief recovery process. And this was triggered by a study of Kenneth Ring, whom we all know, years ago. We know that NDEs have very beneficial after effects, a raft of psychological and behavioral changes which anybody of us would like to have. We would like to have an NDE to have those beneficial changes. Kenneth Ring found out that these changes appear in people who did not have an NDE, but simply read about NDEs. And the more people engaged with that literature and evidence and documentaries and testimonies, the deeper and longer lasting these beneficial changes were. Okay, so bibliotherapy, the acquiring information helps. And so I transplanted this into grief therapy, the therapy of, trying to help people who suffer the loss. And it is clear from anecdotal evidence before and from the randomized controlled trial I'm carrying out that we speak, preliminary results tell us clearly when people engage with evidence, and these and all the areas we're now slowly going through, when they acquire information through bibliotherapy, their grief levels go down and they feel better. Okay, so what suggestion to give to people? Study, look at the evidence, and look, if possible, at credible evidence, because in the catastrophic information society we live in, people think, I've done my research. I looked at a couple of YouTube videos. Help me God. I mean, social media is a toxic pit of madness and folly. All right. I'm sorry. I shouldn't go on about these things, but that's my take.
I think it said, yeah.
Anything and everything that can be said gets said. From flat earthers to we don't want to get into vaccines, etc. Remember, I've been a professor of public health for 20 years, and I have my views about vaccine hesitancy and all that. So if you're interested in these subjects, look for credible resources. Don't look for self-appointed gurus or spiritual leaders or people who tell you, I have understood everything and this is the truth. Mm. The people who really study these things have understood nothing. I do not count myself anywhere near a luminary, but I've been studying a lot of these things. And the best I can say is that I don't know. I do not understand how the survival thing may happen. I can only say to the best of my intellectual honesty that it does. And it's supported by evidence. So look at, if you're not of a scientific mind, so that you could look at peer-reviewed articles, look at books and resources from credentialed people with high credentials, and especially it's not only important to acquire that information, it is important to challenge that information. Use your rational faculties, use your common sense and intelligence to challenge, because then when you examine all possible alternative explanations for these facts and you see that they fail, then a rational belief can emerge.
Yes. No. Well put. It feels to me, you may have encountered this yourself, and I'd love to know if that was your experience too, that you see people are so used to getting an immediate answer to the riddles that they fail to realize that, we're talking about
Absolutely.
a realm which is out of the world that we are trying to describe with worldly terms. So obviously, you know full well that in the years they spend on average years of integration, and they had the direct experience. So imagine
Absolutely.
us that we've not even had this privilege, so to speak. So my question to you is, and I can already guess the answer is there one thing that made you change your mind from one day to another, or was it more like a gradual process of integration and realization?
It has been a long and to some extent arduous process. What happened if I had a penny for every time I told exactly this story, I would go out and buy a Jaguar XK. But what happened, because it's a cute story, and age 44, at that stage, my current wife and I were living in Geneva in Switzerland, and I was materialist, public health, Piero, with cultural interests in Eastern spirituality, but that's as far as I would go. And my wife, Angela, one day over tea in the kitchen, tells me a little story and anecdotes about something that happened to her. She's from Glasgow. When she was a late adolescent, she was about to leave the family home. And there for maybe 2 or 3 weeks, there was a tiny poltergeisty thing, just a funny, some bizarre happenings, nothing major, nothing, Hollywood style, no. But and I could tell that after all these years, she was really not disturbed, but a little perturbed by this. And obviously, I always say she's the person I know best and I trust most. And so with the stiff upper lip I had then, I said, let me see if anything serious has been written about all this. You know what I'm going to say, but I will not. Okay. And I always have it here because in interviews, I like to pull it out. These are the 575 pages by a revered professor of transpersonal psychology, David Fontana, a member of the Royal Society, suffice to say. So the credentials of this man were enough for me to overcome the boggle threshold.
Yeah.
And as you see, the title of the book is There an Afterlife? A Review of the Evidence. Blank. So is it that somebody serious writes about this afterlife business? Well, that was the proverbial rabbit hole, because these 500 and so many pages were followed to this day by about 35,000, I reckon, of literature. And so I always I'm keen to make a distinction between a scholar and a researcher. People who read even technical literature, they're not researchers, they're scholars. So for many years, I have acquired and imbibed myself with information produced by others. And I've been an academic, I've done it in an academic way, but that's the way I function, and because I like to do things seriously, etc. But that's the scholar. Then I started producing my own new novel information, and that's the role of research. End of story. That is to say that the initial years following the seminal reading of David Fontana, I can only describe them as to-ing and flowing, because when every new piece of information, when I finished reading, I would say, really? I mean, it seems like that. But then the doubts creep in and says, it's not possible. There must be an explanation and blah, blah. So you don't give way in one go. Let's put it this way. But now, I'm after reading all that, and after I became member of various scientific organizations, professional scientific organizations in this field. I went to conferences, study days. I even trained personally with Raymond Moody. I dragged myself all the way to Alabama to train with him on his psychomantium technique, very interesting, to facilitate reunions and everything. So I took this really seriously. And so it's not been a linear path. There's been a lot of moving around. But now I'm, as I say, to the best of my intellectual honesty, I can say that I'm an afterlifer, as you say.
Well, so I probably can already guess the answer on this one. So are you afraid of death these days? And what was your vision before, and what about before you started all this research?
My scholarly studies about the survival hypothesis ended up preaching to the convert. What do I mean by that? I mean that I mentioned briefly my cultural interests in Eastern spiritualities and Eastern philosophy, Buddhism to begin with, but then Hinduism in particular, and in particular Advaita Vedanta, the non-dual school of the late Vedic period, about 800 to 500 BC. And that's, as always, very much attracted me intellectually. And so I was already, how could I say, I was a little schizophrenic. So there was the materialist who read physics books, and I liked all these things and everything. But there was a part of me who liked already then the idea that consciousness is fundamental. It's not matter creates consciousness. Consciousness is primary and is responsible for the appearance of matter, which, as we know, is very much in line with the so-called Copenhagen interpretation of the results of quantum mechanics. And so we don't want to get too deep into that. So there was already this sort of intuitive, interesting, in between intuitive and intellectual opening to the idea that my real self is consciousness, and consciousness has no beginning and no end. And then came the storm, the tsunami, the earthquake of all these afterlife studies, etc. And in a way, they go so much together. One reinforces the other. And so as much as I was studying and reflecting on what I was studying, I took my spiritual practice a little more serious, and I started meditating regularly, and I kept reading the text and some of the masters, like particularly Nisargadatta Maharaj and Sri Aurobindo, mystics and philosophers of a level fantastic. And one thing fed into each other. So I'm really overstepping my mark here. I'm going into a territory. You're getting way more than you asked for. The afterlife, for which we have ample evidence in my analysis, is just another form of unreality, just as life on the earthly plane. They're both unreal. Reality is pure consciousness, is naked fundamental awareness before any objects of consciousness appear, right? And objects of consciousness are impressions we have in the material life and the ones we will have in the afterlife. But all that's not real. The real is your naked consciousness. Listen to me. Honestly.
And the years, they say themselves, I think about 70% of them, they come back and they say that reality is even more real than this one here.
Totally. Yeah.
That's great. Well, if there was one thing out of all the stuff that you learned from this research that stood out, which one would that be?
This is something I reflected on and wrote a few times about, exactly in the same terms. I cannot point to the one element. What really did and does the trick to me is the coherence and the consistency of such diverse elements of evidence. And that's another penny for another car every time I use the same method, is that the bamboo sticks, you find yourself on one side of a muddy, sort of a trench with mud and probably alligators and whatever, and you want to go across. And that's, moving from there's no life after life, and the other side of the trench is there is an afterlife, and you want to cross, and you look around, and you find a bamboo stick, which is pretty solid, and you put it across, let's say, near-death experiences. That in itself is essentially enough to support your weight and carry you across the ditch. But okay, I don't want to fall into the mud where there are alligators and so. So you look around and you find another huge stick. After-death communication, mediumship. And you put it side by side to the NDE, and now you have two, and if you're careful and you can go across. But then again, what if they break and I fall into the ditch? So you look around and you find yet another one, deathbed visions, for instance. And now you have three. Once you have put together my 12 or however many, depends, as I said, how you want to slice the cake, you've got a bridge you can go across with the tank. The collective weight of the evidence is so strong, is so heavy, is so, that I say, it can easily transport you from one side of the ditch to the other. So as in, the key is coherence and consistency of such disparate, diverse, different elements of evidence. They all converge there.
Yeah. And we didn't even talk about the work of Ian Stevenson and the divisional perceptual studies.
This is another one of my pillars. Yeah. It's the three big pillars are NDEs, after-death communication, reincarnation studies. Wow. Absolutely. And there's Stevenson, yes, but there is his successor, Jim Tucker. There's Erlinder Haraldsson is also gone in Iceland. There are quite a few researchers who've looked into this past life memories. I am always a little careful about the other side of reincarnation studies, which is past life regressions. There, certain people who have studied that are really serious people, and there's no reason to doubt them. Others are less serious, but that's not the point. The point is that cryptomnesia is a fact. Crypto from Greek to hidden memories. Okay. People may have learned something and they do not remember having learned that. And that may come out as an experience during regression hypnosis. But what worries me more, I'm not discarding the field. I'm just saying that I'm a bit more careful, and my position is quite nuanced on that. What what really makes me doubt a little bit is the fact that has been well demonstrated that false memories can be elicited during a regression hypnosis and can have the same traumatic effect as a real memory. Yeah. Okay, people can get PTSD from an imagined experience. So whilst past life memories are, the evidence is rock solid for me, both psychologically and what is. If one tries to make sense of these things, you cannot, because if it is already very difficult to fathom, to find out a system by which memories of one personality reappear in a totally different body, and that in itself is different. But the birth defect is extraordinary. The biology of reincarnation, studied particularly by Stevenson, but not only, it's really mind-boggling. The fact that children are born with congenital birth defects closely related to the traumatic death they remember in a previous life, hundreds of miles apart, different area, different everything. It's great. How do you make sense of that? I don't know. That's the only thing I can honestly say. I don't know. I don't understand.
How would you say all this research has changed you?
I am of a scholarly disposition, and that's who I am. There's one of my dad, who died years ago, and he bless him. My mom and dad were born in the wrong century. We're looking at Italian aristocrats who would have been at home in the 19th century, not in the 20th, but they were happening there. So it's a happy family, no, nothing, etc. But, there was a certain emotional stiffness and everything. And so things at time were not as easy as they might have been. But my dad passed me a few things for which I will be eternally grateful. Number one, honesty. And to me, this is primordial, especially dealing with such controversial issues. Intellectual honesty is fundamental. You have to be honest to say, I don't know, and to say that I know only when you really done your work, and when you're honest with yourself and you can say things. That's important. And the other thing is the fascination for interesting things, the marvel. And I'm drawn into these studies because I am fascinated by learning, by studying, by finding out. And yes, these things are really bizarre and interesting, but studying anything for me is so. And here eventually I answer your question. Think that, for so many years, I've done one of the things that I like doing most, learning and thinking. And that has changed me in a very good way. However, let's come back to Earth again, if we may. Remember, I'm a medical doctor by training. Remember, before I got into academia, for many years, I worked with International Red Cross in humanitarian assistance. So I am, and I remain, a humanitarian at heart. I really care about my fellow human beings, and I have a strong desire, as much as I can, to be of help. And again, the incredible luck of this incarnation has been the ability of combining my intellectual, scholarly interests with the possibility of making a difference. The books I've written, the research I'm doing on grief therapy, etc., is being useful. People write to me all the time saying, I've read your books and has really helped me in dealing with my loss and everything. That is an incredible act of fortune for somebody who has these two the passion for learning, and the desire of being of help. Hey, I really won the lottery.
Yes, we did. Piero, I have one last question for you. What's
Please.
the meaning of life?
Experiencing. We exist because awareness, which is one of the attributes or is the ultimate reality, needs something to be aware of. And this is not Advaita Vedanta. This is how I like to think about it. So ultimate consciousness is complete in its own, but of its own nature, by the way it is, it generates experiences to be aware of. Hence the world, hence the universe, hence humans in the material world, in the spiritual worlds. We are doing the job of experiencing for consciousness.
Wow, thank you so much.
I really do sound like a guru, eh? Which I'm not.
That's what a guru would say. No, thank you so much. I think we can leave it at that. It's no better way.
A great pleasure, Dani. Thank you very much. This has been very, I must admit, I do a lot of these things, but this is at another level. I really enjoyed, and I thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, all the best for now. Ciao, ciao.
Thank you.
Oh, hi there. Well, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video and want to support the IANDS community, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and maybe share with the ones you love. If you're looking for another video to watch, I think this could be a very good one. New episodes out every Friday, and until then, enjoy the stream we all call life and live the love you wish to see in the world. Bye for now.